The first motherboard that we'll be talking about in this series is in this box. Now, as you can see, this is a Soltech box, and if you listen to the Hardware Asylum podcast, we've already discussed this, but right now we have a Soltech box. This has some free software and whatnot, but the box is a SL85DR-S2, which is a Pentium 4 based motherboard that was in this box. It went into a build and subsequently has gotten lost. But inside we have the nice panel. It's got the awards on the top, but sadly mine was never on there, at least in the boxes that I've gotten. Supposedly it's on some of the others. Some period correct hardware. Network card, ISA bus, Stealth 64 video card, and here's what we're going to be talking about. This is actually an Intel motherboard. It's the VS440FX. The Pentium Pro was an evolutionary jump in processor technology. Before this, with the original Pentium, the level 2 cache was located on the motherboard, usually around the socket, and it ran at a much slower speed. And of course, to increase speed, you need to have your CPU contacting the level 2 cache, contacting the onboard memory as quickly as possible. And to do that, Intel moved the level 2 cache from the motherboard to the CPU. At that point, it was running at the same speed as the CPU, increased performance tremendously. Of course, in 1995, level 2 cache, they couldn't make chips very large, so the range was 256 kilobytes up to 1 megabyte on some of the higher end editions. This particular processor, I think, is one of the small ones at 256, and it's clocked at 180 megahertz. So what we'll do is we'll take a tour around the motherboard so that you can get an idea of what was on these boards. The first thing you'll notice is that we have our standard 7 expansion slots. 4 of them are PCI and 4 of them are the ISA bus. The center one here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, this is shared. So you can either run an ISA card or a PCI card. And the idea is that we have the fingers on opposite sides of the expansion. So this is a PCI card. The fingers are on the left. This is an ISA card. The fingers are on the right. So when you install them, you can take advantage of the different placements and it allows you to share. Over here we have above the ISA bus we have our jumpers. This is how you configure this motherboard to run with whatever processor that you have installed. Incidentally, this is also how you can overclock certain processors that you have installed. Along the side, this is our front panel connections. This is where we can get our power and reset buttons, floppy connector, and 2 IDE connectors. This will be for your hard drives and also for your CD-ROM. Around the board we have various chips to control other components. And what we don't see is a traditional VRM like what you would see on a normal motherboard. So we're looking for a power supply, some chokes and caps, and we basically have 2. But this processor is less than 50 watts, so we really don't need to have a lot of power to it. This particular board does not have the multimedia feature. It's been taken out completely, but we do have 2 serial ports, parallel port, USB 1.0, because that was the thing back then, and our 2 PS2 ports. One for keyboard and one for mouse. Now, these aren't color-coded because Back then, that wasn't really a thing. So what we would like to do is fire this up. We can install some of this period correct hardware and see if this thing still works. I'm going to be using a little bit of modern hardware as we assemble this system. This is my test bench that I use for all sorts of stuff, including liquid nitrogen overclocking, standard overclocking on motherboards with crazy covers that don't actually fit on my regular test bench. This is pretty cool. It's basically a sheet of aluminum that I put some screws in. There's a piece of foam here that keeps air from getting to the back of the motherboard, which is important when you are overclocking with liquid nitrogen. However, we're not going to need that for this particular build, so we'll take that off. The memory used on the Pentium Pro is the 72-pin SIM. Now, unlike DIMMs and SD-RAM from modern, more modern computers, these memory modules have 72 pins, obviously that's where it gets its name, and they have to be installed in pairs, and they have to be matched pairs. So, somewhat like the original SLI or some of the SLI systems where they had to have matched video cards for the best performance. Well, here you should have matched memory sets for it to really even work. This is the part that you need to be especially careful with, is that with old motherboards, they can crack. They get dry, the PCBs do. So you need to be careful when you install these cards. And there we go. Welcome back to the Pentium Pro build from the Hardware Asylum Vault. Things have changed a little bit since I left off a couple of weeks ago, which we can go over in a moment. But let's go over the build first. So we moved the video card to the top slot. We have two Voodoo2s in SLI, which is this ribbon here. We have a Sound Blaster Audigy 2 ZS. And of course the network card down here in the bottom, which is the only ISA card we have in this build. All the PCI slots have been populated. And the problem that I ran into was really more or less a problem with the supporting hardware to make this motherboard work. Now I had intended to show the motherboard starting up, going through the BIOS, and then get an operating system installed, but the problem I ran into was with my IDE hard drive. So this is a Hitachi Desk Star, or as we like to call in the enthusiast world, the Death Star. While this drive worked for many, many years, and it wasn't actually part of the group that went bad, it stopped working. So I had a problem getting an IDE hard drive to hook into the IDE system on this motherboard. So with the IDE hard drive dying, I really had no way to get the operating system installed on this machine. So I went out to Amazon, and the first item that I purchased was this, which is an IDE to SATA adapter. This allows you to plug in SATA drives like an SSD, just like that, and then hook in your IDE ribbon here and plug it into your motherboard. You get jumpers here where you can do your cable select, master and slave settings. The problem I had with this was that the adapter really just kind of wiggles on there. It's not very strong. And while it worked really, really well, I wanted something a little different. So I started experimenting with a compact flash adapter. This has the IDE interface, plugs directly into the motherboard. You plug your card in here, power, you set some jumpers, and you can have an IDE hard drive off a compact flash. I didn't necessarily like this. While it did work, it seemed a little excessive, especially since the compact flash cards I have were quite large. And then it also turns out that you can get one of these guys, which is a And then it turns out that you can get one of these guys, which is an IDE interface to an SD card. So you can take an SD card like this, and it might have a micro SD. This is the one from Lexar. You plug it in here, lock it in place, apply some power, and you can have an SD card as your hard drive. And on these older machines, the IDE interface is still slower than the card, so this might be a good solution for you. However, what I ended up going with was this bidirectional adapter. It's very similar to this guy here. You have your IDE interface, and you have two SATA ports, power, and the same controller or similar controller between these two. This allows you to hook one SATA drive up to your IDE interface and plug this directly into the motherboard. Or you can go the other direction, where you have your IDE hard drive and your adapter, plug it into the back of the drive like this, and then have your SATA cable off of that to plug into a modern system. While this doesn't allow you to run two drives off the IDE interface, it will allow you to run an SSD or Western Digital Raptor. As we're booting up, we have 128 megs of RAM. We'll enter the BIOS real quick. Here we have just the basic menu. Of course, we can set our date, we can set our floppy options. We don't have a floppy installed, but if we did, we would need to set it here. It supports quite a bit, actually, including 128 meg 3.5. Primary master is our DVD drive, Western Digital Raptor, secondary IDE. This menu right here allows you to set the boot options. You wouldn't believe how difficult it was to find this menu. It just kind of blended in to this list. But the most important part is under Advanced. We can see that we have our Pentium Pro 200 with a 256K cache. And since this is a Pentium 180, it's been overclocked using the jumpers on the motherboard. And by switching this jumper, we now have a Pentium Pro 233 with 256Ks of cache. That jumper we set was for the half multipliers, and when you have the motherboard configured for a Pentium Pro 200, the multiplier is 3, but then when you add a half, you can get your 233. And of course the halves are for supporting the 166 and 150 versions of the Pentium Pro. So we're going to go ahead and set it back to 200, boot into Windows, and we'll run a couple of benchmarks and really see what the difference 1/2 of a multiplier makes on the Pentium Pro. purpose of this series is to really go through the Hardware Asylum hardware archives, the vault as we like to call it on the podcast, and pull out some of the hardware that I've saved over the years and explain why it is that this piece of hardware was good enough to make it into the vault. And for this Pentium Pro board, this is one that I got from a coworker, and the whole backstory and a little bit of anecdotal stuff is in the podcast. I'll link that down in the show notes so you can actually check it out for yourself. But the Pentium Pro was one of those products that was unobtainable at the time that I was building computers. The build that I'm showing today is the Pentium Pro. This was a very expensive chip back then. It was really designed more for the corporate users, the people in the office, workstations, whatnot. And it wasn't really intended for gaming. But as I've set it up, I've determined that it really is good for gaming because it can put a whole lot of throughput through the system. And when you pair it with a couple of Voodoo2s, it accelerates the game to the point where it is now actually playable at frame rates above 60 frames per second. Of course, this is also at 640 by 480, so the resolution is a little bit lower than, the modern systems now that we can have running an RTX 3090 or whatnot. But for a period correct computer with a few upgrades here and there, that's really not too bad. As always, if you have questions about our Pentium Pro build, please put them in the comments below. Make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.